Good morning, and welcome to part 2 of the 3-part webinar series, Challenging Ideology, looking at the historical museum practices through an Indigenous lens. Today's event is presented by the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, UBC, in partnership with the UBC Learning Circle and the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank our supporters, the First Nations Health Authority, which generously supports Learning Circle events, the BC Museum Association, which provided funding for this webinar series. Before we formally begin, I would like to gratefully acknowledge with respect that I'm joining you from UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam peoples, for whom we have much gratitude for sharing their territories as uninvited guests with us here today. So holding this event virtually also allows us to engage with people from many different regions. And I encourage you to acknowledge the territory you are calling in from and visiting from as you introduce yourselves in the chat. So thank you. Today's webinar will examine the ideology of decolonization as a current movement in museums and archives. Joining me in this important conversation are Jordan Wilson, who is an emerging curator and a writer and a PhD student in anthropology at New York University; Genevieve Weber, acting head of archives at the Royal BC Museum; and Melissa Adams, librarian and archivist at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Erica Hernandez-Reed, who is the head of Northern BC Archives and Special Collections at UNBC, was previously scheduled to participate, but is unable to be with us today. So I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves more fully in just a few moments. My name is Elizabeth Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center here at UBC and an assistant professor in the Information School at the University of British Columbia. I'll be moderating today's discussion. And we also have a few staff in the background I'd love to introduce. Cynthia Lung is the Learning Circle production coordinator and technical wizard who is behind the scenes making the event run smoothly. Thank you, Cynthia. Shannon Robinson is the Residential School Center's education and programming strategist and is managing the chat function and Q&A function today. And Kristen Kozar is the digital collection specialist at the center and is the curator and brains behind this webinar series. So Kristen is a member of Halitsim First Nation and is co-leading the oral testimony project at the Residential School Center, where her work focuses on research and engagement. So thank you, Kristen, for bringing us all together today. Finally, before we get into today's discussion, I will just provide a gentle note that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself. And at any point you feel the need to talk to a friend, to an elder, to a counselor or family member, please do not hesitate to do so. We've also included a number of resources in the chat, which will continue to show up in the chat throughout the conversation. And we welcome you to take advantage of those as well. So now we'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Melissa Adams. Thank you.
Melissa Adams Schwab. Whoops was in Wubel Queetquee, Simgus Gasney, Get Like Damix will Lee Weekquee, Jamix will Joy. My name's Melissa Adams. I'm a member of the Niska Nation from the House of Wizin Weebilk of the Giskast or Killerwell tribe. I'm from the village of Get Like Damix and currently living and working on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I am very happy to be joining you today. I'm the librarian and archivist at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Did my master's in archival studies at UBC in doing the First Nations curriculum concentration and have also worked at various other libraries, museums, and archives. Thank you.
Jordan, could I ask you to introduce yourself next, please?
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was next or not, sorry. Hi everyone, my name is Jordan. I am a member of the Musqueam First Nation. I'm currently a PhD student at New York University in anthropology. My background is in Indigenous studies as well. I received a Bachelor of Arts in First Nations and Indigenous Studies from UBC, as well as a Master's in Anthropology from UBC. Much of my curatorial experience has been based at the Museum of Anthropology, which has a close relationship with Musqueam. but I've also had stints at other institutions such as the Belkin Gallery at UBC, the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and much of my interests pertain to the dynamics of the relationships between collecting institutions and Indigenous communities, the complexities of dealing with historical collections that are currently held by museums, as well as contemporary Indigenous artistic and cultural expressions. Yeah, so that's a bit about who I am. And I'm so excited to be here today.
I think it's my turn. My name is Genevieve Weber. I'm the acting head of archives at the BC Archives, which is part of the Royal BC Museum. And I'm a settler here living on traditional Lekwungen and Wasanich territories and also working here. And I grew up in these territories and I'm extremely grateful to be able to speak to you from this territory today. In my base position, I do most of my work is with Indigenous communities and working with Indigenous researchers and communities to provide access to material relating to their families and communities. And I also, like Melissa, did the Master of Archival Studies with the First Nations concentration curriculum and have been very privileged to work in a number of Indigenous communities around the province before coming to the museum and archives. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really happy and looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing that and situating us in this conversation as we get started. I think we'll dive right in to the first question. And just as a reminder, we have a few questions that we're going to be chatting about. Feel free to share your questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We have a number of questions from the first webinar, as well as any that we don't get to in this webinar that we'll be carrying forward and sharing in that third webinar. All webinars are being recorded, so if you don't make one, you can catch up on some of those answers our panelists will be sharing. So to start with our first question, let's begin by reflecting on the relationship and learning that have inspired you to engage in the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, or what we often call the Glam sector, and how those relationships and teachings have informed your particular approach. I'm not sure if one of you wanted to start this off, or if I can grab one of you and say, hey, Jordan, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. That's a really interesting question for me to consider. You know, as I mentioned when I introduced myself, that the Museum of Anthropology has had a pretty long-standing relationship with Musqueam, and I feel in some ways, quite privileged to have been trained in that environment as a curator, as a museum studies scholar, because that I think that relationship has really shifted the way in which the museum has operated over the past several decades. And that's not to say that that relationship has always been like a, necessarily great relationship without problems. I think there's been challenges along the way. And I think it's through those challenges that, that a relationship grows and moves forward. And so for me, I didn't really have any experience working in a museum context as an undergraduate student. I wasn't really aware of that field as a career, both professionally and academically. And it was, I think, after my second or third year that I was basically introduced to museum work through a summer position. And that was back in 2009 when the museum was undergoing a major renewal project. And that project was funded by a grant that was wherein Musqueam was a co-applicant for one of the major grants that helped fund that project. And the museum was renovating its permanent displays and expanding those as well. And so I was fortunate to work on the Coast Salish section of that renewal project. And through that was exposed to community consultation and community collaboration and questions and issues around Indigenous representation, how our histories and how our cultures are presented to an audience. And so so for me, it was really kind of growing up in a professional sense in that setting. I think one of the main teachings that I learned in that process and in subsequent projects that have involved Musqueam was an emphasis on the relationship, on process instead of on products and deliverables. I think that museums and universities in general, I think, tend to operate in a model that is very much rooted in capitalist ways of doing things, working on institutional timelines and deadlines, and having those as the priority. Whereas one of the things that like I said, I've really sort of gleaned from working with in that setting, particularly from my auntie Leona Sparrow, who has been involved with the Museum of Anthropology for quite some time and is the UBC Musqueam liaison, is again to really prioritize relationships and the process. And if those are in place, then the project will be successful. So I think that's something that I try to carry forward in the work that I do, to work with the sense of patience and to try to foreground community voices and to listen to those voices and to follow community ways of doing things as opposed to prioritizing institutional frameworks. So I'll leave it there for now, but I think the following questions will probably delve into these ideas further.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Genevieve? Oh, Melissa, thanks.
I unmuted myself, so I guess I'm going next. For me, I kind of getting involved in the Glam world, and particularly Indigenous related aspects of it. I did my undergrad with a double major in history and First Nation studies at the University of Northern BC, like 20 years ago. And my stock answer when I get asked how I got into archives was I like history and I had a chronic need to be organized, and also knew that there was a need for more Indigenous people with training in that area. So that's when I first attempted to do my library and archives degree, which I talked about in the last session a little bit. Found kind of challenges. I was, as I've been a part of this community, I think just trying to understand how Indigenous perspectives and worldviews fit into this very, very Western field. In terms of relationships, I think something that's really grounded me in the past few years is when I moved back to Vancouver a number of years ago to start my current job. I got involved with the local Niska dance group here, the Liga Baigum Niska dancers. And I've just being so involved with community and learning more about the language, learning protocols, developing those relationships even though it sort of seems separate from libraries, archives, and museums, it's not so much. It kind of deepens, I guess, my perspectives on what knowledge and information is. And I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to do some presentations with one of the leaders of that group, Alex, Key and Tate, and that, like, having our two perspectives when we've done presentations, like him with the really deep community knowledge and me coming in with the archives training. Yeah, I've really appreciated just the ability to share about that. And I think too, thinking about relationships and what I've seen as I've worked in different institutions is just the relationships that individuals and communities have to the quote unquote artifacts or records, and just how much joy that can bring when people are able to access them. Like, I was working at Library and Archives Canada, and one of the researchers who was working on behalf of the community asked if he could bring in some community members just to give them an idea of like the kind of files he was looking at and stuff. And to me, they were kind of boring files, or about sand and gravel. And there was a picture in one of this empty field. And because I didn't have those connections to that information, it didn't mean much to me. But like, there was so much discussion as people gathered around this table and were looking at this one photograph and talking about where it was and what was just outside the frame of the photograph and stuff. And just, yeah, just the excitement and joy that the connections that people have with those materials. So yeah, there's all sorts of relationships going on between like institutions and communities, and between different groups, between people and their belongings, really. And that, I guess just the importance of relationships and how grounding that is, and how it takes time to develop them as well. And that continuation and growth really, for me, makes being in these professions more meaningful, and keeps me here, really, when sometimes it's a struggle. Thanks.
I'm so lucky to be on this panel with Jordan and Melissa. So many things that you said resonated. It was great to hear. Jordan, I loved how you said relationships over deliverables, and placing the importance of relationships over deliverables. I think that's so important, and I work in a government institution, and can be really a fight at times to make sure that it comes across as the most important thing. Thinking about relationships and learning, for me, one of the most important and pivotal moments at the very start of my career was I had done the First Nations curriculum program at UBC, and then I had the incredible opportunity to go and live and work for the Niska Nation. And I was working with a wonderful woman, and I did not ask her permission to say her name, but I don't think she'll mind. Her name is Nita. And she was an incredible local knowledge keeper, and she had worked in their archives for as long as it had existed, but it had never sort of existed in a what we call sort of a traditional archives way. There wasn't public access, but she knew everything there was to know about it. And she taught me so many things about relationships to the community. And right at the beginning, in the first week of me working there, she encouraged me to embed myself as much as I could in the community, to attend community events. So Melissa, when I hear you talking about the dance group, everything is so integrated. When I worked there, Nita said, you need to come to the feasts. You need to come to all of the events so that you can really understand the nuances and the intricacies of working with this material and the complexities of providing access internally in the community and potentially one day outside the community. That was incredible teaching for me. And working in a community gave me a completely different and important perspective on things like applying community protocols and how different those can be even from a neighboring community down the river from the one that you're living in, and how you really need to know and understand those particular local protocols in order to apply them properly, and to listen and constantly be listening and learning. And I can talk later about how it was difficult transitioning from that into different types of institutions, particularly government institutions, but I think that will come up later. But that was such an amazing start to my career. I also, before that, one of the most pivotal pieces of learning for me, even before I went up, was I was able to meet Kim Lawson, who I think is on the call today, who was part of the first archivist circle that drafted the protocols for Native American archival materials. And I've had the privilege of working on the group that drafted the reconciliation framework for Canada's archives, which is sort of similar in some ways, but the protocols really outlined the ways that using archival material is so different and important when you're working with Indigenous communities, and it gives a really great framework for doing this work with respect, thoughtfully, and with consideration of the implications, so that when you go into providing access, there's so many more things to think about when you're talking about Indigenous records that don't come up in other situations. I also want to mention one, when I was thinking about this ahead of time, I didn't want to forget one paper that recently really spoke to me. So I'm not particularly academic, and sometimes I have a feeling about something and I don't know how to articulate it. And I've been spending so much of my career thinking about people and the connections of records and people together and how important that connection is. And then a few years back, I read a paper by Michelle Caswell and Marika Seafor. I wrote down the title so I could get it right: From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives. And it just instantly spoke to me. They lay out the 4 types of people and relationships that are often seen in archival work. And the way they described it, and all the different relationships, and the way that every single thing that we do in archives impacts people, it is connected to people. Even like Melissa said, a record about sand and gravel, it may not seem on the surface like that will have an impact on people today, real people, but it does. Everything that we do is connected to humans in our world. And reading their paper just really shifted the way I thought and clarified the way I thought about those relationships. And then I just want to quickly end, again, as the others said, for me, the biggest thing about relationships and learning and how I've learned about the work that I do is working with researchers that come into the reference room or that I meet when I'm doing community work, meeting with people and sitting with them as they experience the joys and the pain and everything in between of accessing archival material, the profound impacts and effects that accessing information and learning something new, or also corroborating something you already knew, that has been the biggest learning for me. Every chance that I get to sit with people and work through that kind of research with them, it's another opportunity for me to learn and grow in my field. And I know that I'll never stop changing the way I approach this work, because every person I meet teaches me something new about it.
I just jumping in again because I neglected to mention another relationship that's been very important to me while doing this is that other colleagues that are in the Glam field that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, they have very much been sources of support, and it's been important to have spaces where it's just us because we are still a minority in these fields, and having those spaces, having those colleagues, yeah, it definitely supports me in this work.
There we go, unmuted. Thank you so much, this technology and mediation. Thank you so much for generously sharing that. There's some interesting themes that I'm hoping we'll be able to return to, particularly around time and how that really informs the work that we want to do and are able to do, as well as that idea of process and deliverable. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but I know it surfaced last time, and I think will continue to surface. And of course, yes, we're always have much gratitude when Kim Lawson joins us. I think many of us stand on the shoulders and have been mentored by Kim in this field, and so much gratitude to Kim. I can't resist a shout out there. I personally have a lot of gratitude there. And then I really love that idea of, Melissa, what is knowledge? What is information? And are we creating these spaces now to really open up those bit broader conversations? So, and thank you. So we'll move on to our next question. Can you talk about significant successes and failures that you have been involved with, and what you've learned from these experiences? I won't call on anyone. I'll let you decide who wants to go first.
I can talk about my failures. I'm good at doing that. I was thinking about this preparing. I have a lot of anecdotes about it, and I will use one to illustrate my point. But I think so many of the times where I've felt like, or it has either legitimately failed, or I have felt a sense that something could have been done better, goes back to time. Again, it's when I've tried to rush something. Again, I work for a government institution. We are driven by key performance indicators and metrics and getting things done on a certain time. We have, our ministry partners telling us what we have to do by certain dates and every year. And that gets in the way of relationship building and doing good work, and trying to build that into our workflow and make sure that there's room for long-term relationship building is really important. There have been times where I have tried to do something far too quickly because I'm excited, I'm eager about the work, and even if I'm not thinking about the metrics and the end goals, just by sheer excitement about doing something that I think will be really positive, I rush it, and then that can lead to all kinds of issues. So one anecdote that I have is when we're working with a community to digitize a particularly important government document that corroborated the local oral history and completely went against sort of the commonly told settler version of that community's history. So this was a key document for the Indigenous community to have for their own uses, but also they were hoping to use it in a local museum display as part of their retelling of their narrative. And it was a really exciting prospect to be able to get this document back to the community that had been very difficult to find. The way it was described in the archives was not intuitive in any way. It was a government record, so it was, lots of government speak in the way it was described. And I was reminded by the person that I was working closely with. He got quite upset when I had the memory stick. We met, and I wanted to give it to him, and he took a step back, and I think he was quite upset by the interaction, and I had offended him. And he said, this is not something we can do standing in a busy hallway with people around us. This is really important. This is sacred. We need to take the time. This is something that needs to be recognized as a pivotal moment that you're handing this over to me. So we took a step back, and you know, I had been admittedly excited to be able to go back to my boss that day and say, guess what happened today? The moment happened. I handed it over. But that wasn't the most important thing about it. There was so much more that had to happen. So we were able to take a step back and change the way we approached that particular moment. And I had to realize that there was so much more to how it was being delivered and what the outcomes were. Similarly, when I mentioned before talking about working in a community and learning so much about applying community protocols to access to records, that really impacted everything I do when I'm working with communities. I'm always aware that there could be internal community protocols that guide who can have access to what information. And I get, particularly earlier in my career, I would get really anxious about making a mistake or doing the wrong thing. And that has happened, absolutely. And over time, I tried my best to every time to ask ahead of time, what are the protocols that need to be in place at this time? Who do I need to be working with? I think, again, jumping in and not taking the time to learn about what the particular rules are in each individual case has caused problems where I've done something wrong, I've made a mistake. So I think the biggest learning for me is to make sure that I take the time to listen to what the researchers or the communities are telling me about what needs to be done, rather than me trying to tell them, or like I said, in my excitement to say, let's do it like this. I have this great idea. It has to be about what is best for that person or that group. I ended up not using all the anecdotes. I don't know if that was a little bit rambling, but I guess that's just to say that lots of times I rushed into things. I need to slow down. That's it for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. No, I think I'm just looking at the chat, and as you know, Kim, we were just speaking how she shares her wisdom with us, was, as she phrases it, quote, a great reframing and a humility story. And I think that's it. We often talk about having humility in the space. And I think it comes back to something, you know, Melissa was saying, is that there's an underrepresentation in these areas of Indigenous people, people of color, Black people. And so coming together to do this work and support each other is, I think, you know, challenging, but also, you know, working across, you know, with colleagues is really important in this space. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's exactly what we were trying to uncover there. So I don't know, Melissa or Jordan, if you have anything you'd like to share in this. And it doesn't have to be failures, it can be successes. So if you have more anecdotes, Genevieve, we want to hear them.
I can share a bit that maybe is some of both, but I think one of the challenges I've had in doing this work is, well, also similar to Genevieve, rushing to do things without taking the time to build those relationships first or something like that, but also really similar concerns about worrying that you're going to be doing the wrong thing, and that almost freezes you. And relate to that, like not asking for help when I should have, partly because I think, I'm not quite sure how to put it, maybe I've like almost internalized some of the racism a bit, that I have to do things like perfectly, because otherwise, you know, someone will say you're getting special treatment because of your status or what have you. So, but one of my very first grant application was very fortunate to be to the indigenization program. So shout out to them, because I totally. I messed up the financial part of the application because I didn't understand something and I should have just asked ahead of time, but I really felt like I had to do this myself. And they were very, very kind in explaining what I did wrong and allowing me to resubmit it. And so I'm very grateful that my first grant application was to them, and they were so helpful to me. I think one of the other things that I've learned in recent years is, and something I've struggled with, is just not burning myself out, because like we were talking about during the last presentation, in the past 10 years or less, with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, with the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, there's been a lot more interest in doing Indigenous related work. And so suddenly I was getting all these requests to be on committees or to speak, and just I don't know that I was, just because I was so stretched so thin, I don't know that I was able to do that, contribute effectively, and also it was taking me away from like time spent doing that community learning. So that was something I had to learn how to do, was just to step back, to kind of be able to evaluate just how much I could manage to do. And Genevieve was talking about like the fear of messing up. One of the things that articles that I always give a mention to, a blog post, is from April Hathcock, who's a Black lawyer and librarian, and she wrote a blog post about white allies who are doing race work, and it's called "You're Gonna Screw Up." And yeah, that's something I recommend to people, because you will, it's going to happen. So, but that shouldn't let us stop. Yeah, we shouldn't, just because of that fear, should not stop us from doing things.
Yeah, so many things to think about with this question for me. One of the projects that I continuously return to in thinking through these types of questions is a 3-part exhibition that I worked on back in 2014, titled "Cessna, the City Before the City," because I think it offers a really valuable model for community and institutional collaborations. It was a project that was the result of teamwork between the Museum of Anthropology, the Museum of Vancouver, and Musqueam. And it was looking at the ancestral village and cemetery of Tsetnam, commonly known as the Marpole Midden, which is located in what is now South Vancouver. And I think that project offered a lot of lessons for me in terms of its successes and failures, because it was such a close collaboration. I think one of the successful aspects is that Musqueam was involved in it from the beginning to the end, along every step of the process. So even from applying for the grants to making design decisions, programming, marketing. Of course, the curatorial team was both comprised of both Musqueam community members and non-Indigenous curators from MOA and MOB. And so I think that was really important, because often with exhibition projects, for example, I feel that communities are often positioned as like sources of knowledge and information and perspectives that are only really sort of engaged at one step of the process in terms of developing the content of the exhibition. But from my perspective, this was important because, again, like, community was engaged in all aspects of its development. I think one of the other successful aspects of that project was that we had convened an advisory group of Musqueam elders and community leaders to help steer the project. So for us as co-curators, as a curatorial team, we could look to them for advice and guidance, because I think, you know, along what Genevieve and Melissa have mentioned, this idea of like knowing that you don't have all the answers, that that you are bound to make mistakes, that you're bound to have questions, that helps, I think, reassure us in that way. I think maybe not thinking of the project, you know, of failures, but of challenges. Being a community member working in the institutional setting, working on a project like that, I feel like there's an extra sense of accountability, which for me personally, I verged on like being a burden, you know, like, because if, you know, if mistakes were made, you know, if the project wasn't a success, I feel like I would still, you know, have to, you know, return to my community, return to my family in ways that non-Indigenous curators don't necessarily, you know, don't have that ongoing relationship, you know, aren't, you know, part of the community in the same way. And that, yeah, was definitely a challenge. I think another aspect of that project that I've wrestled with is, you know, who benefits the most from those types of initiatives, because it's hard to see institutional change after a temporary exhibition, for example. I think maybe that the institutional practices do change and the institution learns from those engagements, but, you know, as we were talking about in the last session, the infrastructure of the institution often remains the same. So I think that is in some ways a failure, that institutions often engage with communities on a, you know, limited basis, and engage with Indigenous curators in the same way. And so I think it's, despite the, you know, despite the community involvement, despite the community investment, that there's still potentially an extractive quality to that relationship. And yeah, I guess that's something that I've carried forward, is how can these types of relationships and how can these projects be reciprocal, or perhaps how can the community benefit even more than the institution does, because I feel that often even the most successful projects, the institutions still benefit in different ways, and that's definitely something that I wrestle with. Yeah, I think I need to take a moment to think about that question further. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think that's it, right? We're asking really big questions here, and reflection. We've just, as we're, you know, we've heard generously from you all the time, is such a crucial factor in approaching this work, but also in approaching our engagement with these conversations. Just a quick housekeeping note, we will be compiling resources from each of the webinars into where the Learning Circle will be posting, where you can view the recordings, and we will have a list of all of the resources and blog posts and articles and other things that have been mentioned in each of the webinars, continually updating those. So they'll be mentioned in the chat when possible. If not, they will be available post this. So please don't worry, you're not going to miss out on those. We're super keen to share those. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that last question, but a few key things. Again, thank you for really generously sharing that have come out, and I think are ongoing themes that if we are afforded the time to circle back to, depending on the questions, is really that idea of who benefits, right? And that idea back to time again. So we're talking about time sometimes is not necessarily the equity idea of time. Is the time on the institution side is very much the ruling agent, and the time that necessarily is needed to do it well isn't afforded. Yet when it comes to actual change for institutions, that can sometimes feel a bit glacial if you're on the side that's not benefiting from the change. So I think that it's continually resurfacing, I think, in this work. I also think that the weight, a number of you have mentioned, and we talk about this in the professional law, is that weight on, as Melissa brought up earlier, there's not an overrepresentation of Indigenous folks or people of color in our field. And so the weight and the expectation on those that are operating in the field, I think, is quite great. At times can and should be doing to support the shift and the change. And then that kind of idea of courage. The flip side of that humility often we think about is that courage. So I thank you all for courageously answering these questions and sharing your experiences. So if I want to hold a moment, if anyone wants to add to that last question, we can certainly circle back, or I can move on to the next question. Genevieve, Melissa.
Oh, sorry, Genevieve, you unmuted.
Okay, I was just going to follow up because I, with a desire to mention some successes. I have lots of anecdotes of successes, but just to follow on that idea of time, I recently had a meeting with an Indigenous group of archivists and cultural heritage workers working with one of the communities in which a residential school was located that we have records for. And one of the most important things it was a great moment because they clearly articulated that they are not yet ready in this particular community to receive the records. We have them, and we've been working with various communities to provide access and get copies of the records into the communities. And some of the communities are ready right now. They have the infrastructure. The community has been preparing in a lot of ways to get the information. But this community said, we're not ready. And I think they were worried that the response would be, okay, well, too bad, it's now or never, which of course was not the answer. And I was able to say to them, that's fine, just tell us when you're ready. We've got it. We're ready for you. And when you're at that point, then we'll be ready to work with you. So that moment was such a great moment. I think that there was just relief on all of our parts, that we all felt comfortable that we're doing this together and we'll both be there for each other when the time comes. And recognizing that just because one party is ready doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right time for the other party. So again, that was just that thinking about time and how important it is to respect people's time, and in whatever way that means. Whether that means now is when we should be doing it, or now is not when we should be doing it.
Melissa, there you go.
Yeah. I am going to shamelessly put in the chat a Twitter thread I did a few years ago of questions that I think about when just thinking about time and about the self-learning I've had to do in terms of what I can take on. I'm going to put a thread in the chat about the questions that I ask myself when non-Indigenous people or organizations ask me to participate in something. So I will put that there for future reading.
As you're doing that, I'm just going to echo what Kim said. Oh, I love that thread. And as soon as you said that, I think we all went, oh, yes, we know that. That was widely shared, I think, and cited, and continues to be, when we talk to students and engage with partners, that it was just a brilliant thread. So I don't think it's shameless at all. I think it's very generous. And thank you for sharing it with us, because I think it just is so, so generous and really think making us all think and do this work better. So I'm so glad you shared that. And I hope we're able to share it on the resource page if you're comfortable with that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can send you a PDF copy of it. And also this, like, that thread is not unique to me. I think at the time I was writing it, there was funding around, I think Canada 150, maybe in TRC funding. So there's a special uptick in people wanting to collaborate in all sorts of different fields. So yeah, my experience with that is not unique.
Thank you so much for that. And again, that it kind of comes back to, some of those themes, right? That idea of, there's great, I think, hope and satisfaction in UNDRIP coming into, national legislation, the TRC calls being taken up by professions and DRIPA, in the province as we move to implement these, particularly in the cultural heritage sector or the Glam sector, how we want to phrase that. But yeah, the other side of that is exactly that cultural loading. So the weight of I guess my question then is, I read a rhetorical question, do the resources support it, or in what is it being done in, I guess, good faith, for lack of a better term. So third question I'll jump onto, and I think you set us up quite nicely for this, so thank you. What would be an ideal future for the Glam sector in regards to incorporating and being informed by Indigenous protocols and ways of being and knowing? So again, I don't want to call anyone out. I'll let you take a moment and if someone wants to kick this off, that'd be lovely.
I have two things I in response to this. And the first thing, it may seem like it doesn't apply to the Glam sector as a whole, but I think it really does in so many ways that we're not even always aware of. But the first thing I want to say is legislative reform. You just mentioned, Elizabeth, with UNDRIP being adopted nationally and provincially. Here, I work for a provincial government institution, so DRIPA applies to the work that we do. So the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which essentially builds into legislation that we must adhere to the articles of the United Nations Declaration, which is fantastic. And there have been government initiatives to describe how that should happen. It doesn't speak specifically to how it happens in my work, but where there's real issues is when it clashes with the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act or other acts that restrict or protect information in ways that are really important, but don't allow for that recognition that is outlined. I think it's in Article 31 of UNDRIP, which clearly states that Indigenous peoples have the right to control access to information and knowledge keeping from their communities. Information in government records is so often inherent Indigenous knowledge that that requires full access, but the current legislation is at odds with one another, and that creates real issues around access to information and the ability to control and have ownership over the information. So that's a big one. And again, I know, as I said, I work for a government institution, so my experience with it is different, but it impacts every researcher, every community member that is out there attending museums and gallery events. Their inability to access information based on the way the legislation is written at the moment is really problematic. So then the other thing I wanted to say is the ideal that I see for the future of Glam organizations is true ownership and control of information, whether it's government or non-government. True ownership and control by Indigenous communities and people over the knowledge and information that is kept in archival records, through either by the principles of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession, or in cases where that is either not appropriate or not desired or not possible in some way, then through really robust shared stewardship arrangements. So I didn't mention all of the articles that I could maybe send a list later for the resources, but there is so much great research that's been done in recent years around shared stewardship again, I'm speaking specifically about archives, but around archival material, that sees a number of different ways in which ownership of information is inherently recognized and control over the information is recognized, where it might still physically remain in a repository for a number of reasons. And in some cases, that's to do with resourcing and the ability to preserve it. And some communities want to continue with that relationship. But institutions have the opportunity to enter into agreements that recognize that the institution actually has no right over the knowledge that is contained in those records. But that we have a responsibility after years of colonial control, we have a responsibility to continue to do that work if that is what is wanted by the owners of the information. After so many years of having complete control over it, I think the least we can do is pay for the preservation of it while somebody else takes over in the control that they should have had all along. So those are the things that I would like to see going forward, my ideals for the future of specifically archives. I tend to always answer very specifically around what I know. So, so that's why my answers are very, very focused on archival work.
Thanks, Genevieve. And I think, it's very timely, right? Your answers around archival work as we, continue to address the, disclosure, release, access, stewardship of records, as you've talked about. It's very much, I think, at the fore of many conversations right now. Melissa or Jordan, did you want to weigh in on that question? The future of the Glam sector and incorporating Indigenous protocols, ways of knowing?
I can say something. I don't know how articulate or specific it will be. But one of the things I've seen as I've been working at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs over the past few years is just, and seeing reflected in our archival collection, is just how we are struggling for the same issues over, like, for years. Like, there's a chief now, I know as an elder, who mentioned recently that he had just seen in one of our in our archival collection an image of his, or actually it was a video recording of his grandfather at one of our meetings back in the 70s. So there's like generations of people who've been working for Indigenous title and rights, and I just and for our laws and protocols to be included. And this is a very non-specific vision, other than it would be nice not to spend so much time engaged in that struggle and just be able to engage in our languages, in our cultures, in our practices, and not have to struggle to access information, struggle for control, struggle to use the belongings that are in museums. If, an ideal world, our protocols would be respected as a given, and there wouldn't be the struggle there. Yeah, that's initial big thoughts.
Yeah, for me, the first thing that comes to my mind, I think, echoes what Melissa's thread was getting at, which I think, to my mind, is institutions and organizations doing things for the optics rather than because the work needs to be done, particularly over the past few years, I would say, like, that institutions and organizations are more concerned with appearing to do the right thing than maybe actually doing the right thing and thinking through what that is. I think in my ideal future that more money would be in this sector to tackle these big issues. I feel like resources is obviously, or a lack of resources is obviously a barrier. But with that, I think that that money and those resources should be in the hands of communities and not in institutions. I feel like, again, like particularly over the past 10 years, say that, yeah, a lot of labor and energy goes into these types of relationships, and as Melissa was saying, like that in many ways diverts those resources and energy and time away from community-oriented needs and desires. And so I think because institutions still wield the power, they still in some ways are the gatekeepers to resources in this sector particularly. So yeah, like it cycles back to the question of like successes and failures. I feel like a failure, and again, like failure feels like a harsh word to use, but I think for the Tsetsnon project, for example, or other projects that I've been involved in, they're still premised on like Western ways of knowing, Western forms of pedagogy. And so I wonder about ways in which we can think outside the box and leverage these resources or funnel them into projects that are, again, more oriented. I mean, I guess that's what this question is about, oriented more towards Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and transmitting knowledge to future generations. Because, yeah, part of me questions if museum exhibitions or books are necessarily the best way to reclaim culture, to revitalize language, but again, like these are all things that I've been a part of and, community members also value. So it's not, I don't know if failure is the right word, but I do think that there are maybe opportunities to move away from institutional models towards more community-based Indigenous models for these types of endeavors. But yeah, for me, it's like the question just kind of generates more questions rather than, me being able to provide a clear answer.
Thank you both for that, Melissa and Jordan. And I think that, Kim Lawson has shared with us in the chat as well, just that idea of the foundational, I think something you've all been speaking to, this should be foundational principles. A lot of energy goes to something that should be existing so that more work can move forward and be done. And I think, again, we're coming back to that idea of the resourcing, the lack of resourcing, who controls those resources. And then, something you mentioned, Genevieve, that idea of metrics and what counts, what needs to be counted. And, I'm thinking about something you just said about, all of you said shifting these models, right? So we often are trying to take something and cram it into an institutional frame. And then particularly around Melissa's thread really raises that particular moment in time when there was a lot of what felt like box ticking going on perhaps. And so how do we ground it differently? And I guess one of my thoughts and something I would throw out to you all if you would like to weigh in is really, that opportunity to inform that alignment with legislation. Is there a role for the Glam community, for Glam professionals to really push a bit further into informing, aligning? So, part of DRIPA, UNDRIP, is really aligning implementation, and something you said, Genevieve, they're often at odds with the legislation. The principles that are fundamentally contained in the articles of UNDRIP are fundamentally sometimes at odds with privacy legislation, access legislation, government accountability legislation. Is there a role for the Glam community to be more advocate a more advocate role. We have the reply to the calls for the TRC, calls around museums and archives, but is there more that the Glam community can and should be doing to push for this alignment? Because they're really well aware of the conflicts that arise between accessibility, usability, as Melissa said, they should be accessible, usable, and in the control of communities, and they're often coming into conflict with existing legislation. So is there a role there? I would put to you, I don't know, Genevieve, if you want to kick us off there, perhaps.
Yeah, this is something that's been on my mind a lot, and I've been trying to figure out, I think there is a role. I would love to see, I know that there's advocacy groups, and I brought it up recently with the Indigenous Advocacy Committee of the Association, the Archival Association of BC, to specifically look into what we can do, and where I think we might have the most success is in getting many groups together to have a bigger voice. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've been saying, I think pushing for legislative reform is one way to do it, but I think there's other ways as well. And I don't know if just having legislation change is enough. There needs to be such an overhaul of government practices that relate to implementing legislation, but just access in general, access to information in general. So I guess my short answer is I haven't worked, I don't know, I haven't figured out in my mind exactly what the next step is, but I've been trying to talk to a lot of my colleagues to get lots of brains working on it together. So I would love anybody else on this call who's interested in participating and trying to come up with some solutions to be in touch, because I think it's really important. It's just something I'm thinking about every day. It literally comes up every single day in my work. We get people daily asking for access to records, and it's in both ways. It's Indigenous folks asking for access to records, and us feeling like we are stuck within these parameters where we're not able to provide access, and non-Indigenous people asking for access and the permission to use records that are of Indigenous people. So particularly photographs is the big one. And for most of our existence, well, since we started digitizing records in particular, people had free reign to do pretty much whatever they wanted to do in terms of accessing records of Indigenous folks and communities and cultural practices and publishing them in books. And now we're really trying to implement the concepts in UNDRIP, but there isn't. There needs to be a bigger conversation among the Glam sector and broadly about what that looks like and what our roles and responsibilities are, and how we work on the decision-making part of it, and that's where we're finding ourselves stuck in terms of the ability to move forward. We don't have agreement and consensus across the sector around how we approach these issues. So I don't know, I'm hesitant to do the government thing and say we should form a working group, but we need to somehow come together with people who are facing this issue and see what is working.
Thank you for that. I think it was very frank and thoughtful. I appreciate it. Melissa, Jordan, do you have any thoughts on any kind of role the Glam, advocacy or however you want to phrase it could really push to start to shift some of these conversations?
I don't know that I have a particular thought at the moment, because I feel like there's a lot that I need to learn just about how government operates. I don't feel like I have a full enough understanding to say this is the answer, but we should connect, because there may be people in my organization who may be interested, and talk to me again in January when I'll have more time.
I want to say that nobody knows how government works. I've been in it for like 11 years. and it's still hard to figure it out.
But yeah, so related to that, I feel like it's a multi-pronged approach. It's, you need the sort of laws, etc., but also how does that apply? How does that change attitudes within institutions? Like, it's so layered. And I feel like I don't really know enough to answer anything articulately, but we still exist in this, under this legislations. This is the system one of the systems we operate in. So we can't ignore that side of that, I don't think. That's all I have to say.
Oh, thank you for sharing it. Jordan, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I put a little, I think maybe this speaks to this question, but I think, you know, there being like ways of evaluating institutions and organizations, whether they are meeting the recommendations of the TRC or whether they're meeting UNDRIP. And if they aren't, then maybe they don't get the money that they're seeking from granting agencies, for example. So I think it's kind of a matter of, you know, involving Indigenous peoples in the development of policy in terms of how money and resources are allocated. And I think it's a matter of perhaps like shaming institutions who aren't, and organizations who aren't in the 21st century or who aren't doing things for the right reasons or in a good way, and to reward the ones that are, like a scoring system. For example, I think that could be one way, you know, like, and again, those are kind of like the questions that Melissa offers in her Twitter thread, I think, you know, are an example of that, you know, like basically establishing some form of criteria to, really sort of get at how these places are doing things and whether they are meeting community needs or not.
Thank you so much for that. I like that idea, that kind of evaluative framework that is really, you know, led by Indigenous peoples and communities as an accountability measure, right, for this idea. And I feel a dialogue brewing here around some of this stuff. So I'm excited about that. I think there's some good thoughts here. I guess one thing that was also mentioned, Genevieve, you know, you talk about that shared stewardship model, and I want to give a shout out to, you know, Erica, who wasn't able to join us, but that's something Erica and UNBC have been doing for some time, is that shared stewardship model, really, you know, walking the walk of being in service to communities and archive. Complete and, you know, control of the archives and records are in the hands of communities, and UNBC takes on that stewarding role, the idea of providing those resources, but is completely hands-off, with the exception of administering direction from community in those. And I think that those, I wonder, you know, those kinds of models of people just doing things, and as you mentioned, there's more and more coming forward. I think about, you know, as you know, the center here, I'll give a shout out to UBCIC and a project with Slatching that we've done around the Indian Child Caravan. And from the get-go, all of the information and records generated from that were to be, you know, at the discretion and direction of the community, who wanted them dispersed across all of the archives, but fully in their control. So again, that idea of stewardship modeling and taking ownership, you know, not taking ownership, but just taking responsibility to put resources of an institution in service to communities. So, you know, I think we're seeing some of these models come up, but they have to, and I guess my thought is, you know, they have to work in between the cracks, as opposed to really being the normative approach. There's still, you know, something Kim Lawson said in the chat. So I'm just looking at Kim now, and she's speaking to you in the chat. She shares the right to reply. So UNDRIP, in the way that copyright are ignoring the rights of individuals and communities that are represented in photos and other materials, these are really difficult frameworks, right? So the right to be forgotten, the right to knowledge, the right to be, and it's far more nuanced, right? As opposed to an open and closed dichotomy that is traditionally in North American Glam institutions. So, and again, as Kim says, it comes back to the shifts you were talking about, the relationships with Indigenous peoples as entities, as opposed to living, breathing, instead of being the content or subject. So really, again, the idea of agency. And I think as, those of us who come from the archival space, and I don't know if you can speak to this, Jordan, I think this comes from the museum space as well, of, those who hold the rights often to the information are not those whom the information has been collected about. They're the people who've collected it. And, that shift seems slow to move. So projects like Sustenance, as you said, really help to shift that. Other projects, I know that EBCIC and RBCM is involved with through Genevieve's work with community records help. So I guess that would lead me to something that's kind of been underneath all of this, as I wonder, what's the role of education in all of this? So as we're really pushing to move this change, and as many have shared, explicitly or implicitly around the challenges of education in these fields, is still quite normative and still structured around some of these models. And it's very challenging to be in these spaces and hold space in these conversations as a racialized person, as an Indigenous person. How do you think, what's the responsibility or the role or the opportunity here? We're sitting at BC for education to help shift some of this moving forward. Do you think there's a role for education? Could I maybe, Melissa, could I ask you to start, or Jordan, did you want to start? I keep asking Genevieve to start, but if you want to start, I'd like to start. I'll throw it out there.
I can start, but first I want to jump in with another comment, which actually relates to education. Part of shifting things is you just have to start doing it, like UNBC has done with providing that space for materials. Because when I was in archive school, I learned that you do not take in anything you don't have ownership and control of, and that's because that's a waste of resources. You're taking up space that you could be using for materials you do own. So yeah, going against doing something different, you could just start doing it. Or like in digitization, you don't have to make whatever you digitize a community, or doesn't have to make whatever they digitize public in order to get that funding. They make that decision. So yeah, just as part of making change is just going ahead and making change. And short answer to the role of education and all of this is yes, there is a role. And just incorporating two things. One, incorporating Indigenous perspectives, like letting students know they exist. There are these protocols out there and that kind of thing, but I think there's a sort of caution in that you're not pan-indigenizing as you do this. But yeah, like I was saying in the last panel, I came out of my archives education thinking that archives were these certain structured things, and Indigenous knowledge and information was something completely separate, and I had to unlearn that. So making then obviously that's not the case. So yeah, incorporating Indigenous perspectives, and also, like we talked about last time as well, just being aware of the history, that colonial history, and how that has shaped our fields, and why things are the way they are. We have to know where we came from as professions. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Genevieve, Jordan, do you have anything on that particular topic around education?
I don't have too much to offer. I think, thinking about the parallels with like law, for example, I think we're starting to see changes, at the UBC Law School, having a, mandatory course on Indigenous law, for example. And so I think maybe there's a potential way forward there, in that people who are entering the Glam sector, in their education, to be exposed earlier on to these issues and ideas and these histories, as Melissa was saying, in terms of like understanding where we are now and what the contemporary problems are, so that when that when people are in positions of power later on, that they have a stronger understanding of what needs to be done. That's really about all I have to offer to that question at this point.
I think it's my impression that somewhere like the School of Information at UBC has added a lot more important Indigenous content and learning into its classes since I was there. People keep referring to me as a mid-career professional, and I'm always amazed that it was that long ago that I went to school, but it was quite some time ago now. So I think there's been some significant changes since I did the program, which is great. And I really think that Indigenous ways of knowing and learning about records and archives and knowledge management needs to be incorporated into the core coursework. When I did the First Nations concentration curriculum, I think they at times had offered very specific information management courses, but they didn't have any on offer when I was there. So the idea was that I took courses outside of these, what at the time was called SLACE, the archival school, in order to get that learning in addition, alongside. So like Melissa said, it was very much, this is archives, this is Indigenous knowledge. However, that having been said, one of the courses I took was an Indigenous research methodologies course. And that has served me so well in everything I've done since. There was a number of courses that I took that were great. I took an education class, a higher level education class on Indigenous education methodology as well, which was also really good. But I remember the Indigenous methodology, research methodologies, gave me such a concise and great grounding in doing research, which of course is the opposite side of providing access to archives, but it gave me tools that I could put into place in every situation that I've worked in since, whether it was in Indigenous communities, at somewhere like MOA, in an education site, in the government. So what I would love to see is that sort of coursework being made a core part of what every student has to take, whether they think they are going to work with Indigenous material or not, because guess what? Everyone does. We live in a province that is built on Indigenous land. So every single thing that we do and every record that we create somehow eventually is connected back to Indigenous knowledge in some way. So we need to be making it, as we said before, this, as Kim said in the chat and other people said, this sort of work should not be something that we add on to make us look good or to make us feel good, or even as part of relationship building. It should be core and fundamental to everything we do. So it should also be core and fundamental to the education.
I am mindful we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to jump in quickly too with regards to education. As we also need to be thinking about how we're supporting Indigenous students in these fields. And yeah, for reference, you can look to the what I learned in class today that UBC has done. I'm just putting a link in the chat. So
Thank you for that. We'll share that in the resources as well. That's such a clear point. And I think all of you, thank you for that. I think that role of education, and that it shouldn't be an add-on, that it should be fundamental and taught throughout, woven throughout all of our work is crucially important. I would invite you, I know we only have a couple minutes left, maybe 30 seconds to a minute. If you have, is there any one last piece of wisdom on this topic broadly that we've been discussing around, the relationships and learning and engagement that you would impart to the audience. So any parting words? And I'm going to be cheeky and call so we can move through. Genevieve, again, I'm going to be cheeky and ask you to start.
Oh, I don't know. I think I just went completely blank when you asked me.
No,
Sorry, I'm going to pass it on to someone else.
That's okay. What I'll do is I won't do that to anybody. I will say, is there anything? And just pause for a moment. I mean, I think you've shared so much of your wisdom with us today, and you've been so generous in sharing your experiences and some ideas for ways forward that we can do this work better and together. So I have much gratitude for that. So, and Melissa or Jordan, are there any final thoughts? No pressure to have any. You've shared a lot with us already.
I just wanted to thank Kim Lawson for being our respondent in the chat.
And yeah, also thanks to Kim. And I don't feel like I have anything particularly wise to say, but sometimes I just feel like I need to say we're still here, and I'm glad we're having these discussions, and they need to be carrying on for the long term.
Thank you for that. And agreed. I think these dialogues need to really continue, and we need to make sure we have space and support for them to happen and be led by Indigenous peoples and communities. And of course, Kim, your wisdom is always, so welcome, and such gratitude for standing on your shoulders, as many of us do, and for holding the space in such a really honest and good way for all of us. So yeah, I think we all have much gratitude there. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for generously sharing all of their wisdom and thoughts with us today, and to everyone for joining us and taking the time on Thursday morning. So I'd also like to remind everyone that this is part 2 of a 3-part series. If you missed part 1, it's available on the Learning Circles YouTube channel. The 3rd and final webinar will take place on November 18th at 10 a.m. the same time with the same panel. I believe Erica will be joining us for that. If you didn't have your question answered today, we encourage you to join the final webinar, where we hope to have panelists answer any unaddressed questions from the audience, and I'm sure sharing more of their wisdom and insight. So again, I think we're bang on time, and thank you all again very much, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Take good care.